Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's been interesting. I get to take my mask off under the rules now. We haven't quite caught up with the science here in the House, but hopefully the House of Representatives that has leadership proclaiming that we need to follow the science refuses to do so so far, but we're hoping we'll eventually get people here, at least the majority, to follow the science. But it's been an interesting time, not a good time, not a wonderful, enriching time to be in the House of Representatives. It's been an exceedingly frustrating time. After January 6th, apparently the number one goal here in the House was something referred to as optics. According to the Sergeant at Arms, the reason National Guard was not brought up in advance in January 6th, so there would be no one entering the Capitol that was not desired to enter the Capitol, was that word optics. So the Capitol Police, doing the best they could, were left to fend for themselves without support they needed. It's a big place. But had the number one concern before January 6th by people here in Washington, at the Capitol at least, if that number one concern had not been optics, there would have been no one coming in to the Capitol that we didn't want to be in the Capitol. Since then, we've been entertained by all kinds of false statements, false allegations. It has really been amazing, but the number one thing we keep coming back to is apparently it's not about getting at the truth, it's all about optics. The top person charged with the safety of members of Congress, head of the Capitol Police, months ago indicated that there was no intel from any source that any member of Congress was at risk or a threat to any other member of Congress. No member of Congress was at risk from another member of Congress. Since then, as I understand it, there was an ethics charge leveled at Marjorie Taylor Greene that she was encouraging a debate with another member of Congress, and somehow that is apparently an ethics violation. I mean, I had a Democrat some years back come up and threaten to kick my buttocks. I think he used other language, but had he swung, I might have filed a complaint. But here on the House floor, what we have are words, and we get into very heated debates at times because we care deeply about the things we care deeply. But those are not assaults. There have been assaults in the Capitol, and I know memory is apparently a big question these days, but when the President of the United States stands right up here at the second level, as presidents have since this opened before 1860, and have made speeches. In this case, it wasn't to a joint session, it was to invitation-only session, but indicated that what happened on January 6th was the worst attack on democracy since the Civil War. So, being an ongoing student of history, since Coach Sam Parker instilled a love in me for history, especially American history, the good, the bad, the ugly, the incredible. I've continued to be a student of American history, world history as well. So sometimes it's helpful for those that don't know our history or can't remember our history to be reminded that since the Civil War put an end to slavery in America, even though it took an ordained Christian preacher resolutely, peacefully advocating for civil rights and that the Constitution should be used as a document that means what it says. And as the Declaration of Independence made clear, we are endowed not by government but by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And Dr. King's letters from a Birmingham jail as he was unjustly incarcerated, pretty powerful words from a man full of vision. We miss his vision. I think things would be very different if he were still alive today. The assassin did grave damage to the United States of America and the benefits we would have had from a visionary still if he were alive today. Because there are some that say if you even use words to debate that somehow you're an insurrectionist, you need to be jailed. And that has been happening since January 6th. And when it comes from people that told us, in fact, January 6th of 2017, I believe there were 11 different Democrats that stood up and forcefully objected to the results and to the electors that were voting for President Trump. And there was not a single Republican I ever heard on our side of the aisle that accused them of, trying to overthrow the government, insurrection, all these things that some of us have been accused of, simply wanting a fair election in which the votes of tens of millions of Americans were not disenfranchised. The very same thing even our current speaker has said back in prior days about prior elections. So imagine the shock for those of us that for the last 20 years have been preached to by people on the other side of the aisle about the unfairness of election, the vulnerability of electronic elections, who seemed disgusted that some of us had the same kind of objections they had about the election in November. There is nothing illegal, improper, against the House rules of objecting. And yet we had people on the other side of the aisles who were encouraging all kinds of punishment for those on this side of the aisle that did exactly what Democrats have been doing for 20 years or so, objecting as they did January 2001. And we saw objection January 6th of 2005. And these woke corporations that now want to punish anybody that objected to potentially, and there is evidence of fraud in the November 2020 election, and those that say there was no fraud in the election are either doing so knowingly, knowing that it's false, what they're saying, or just because they bought into what the mainstream, lamestream media has reported. But there was fraud in that election. There usually is some fraud in national elections. And in states where it was somewhat close compared to the number of people voting, like Arizona, they're doing the right thing. They're trying to have an audit, and obviously the efforts at the audit is being covered up. There is evidence being destroyed. I guess a bit like when you have a Secretary of State that destroys evidence that she has that's being sought, has it destroyed with a hammer or with bleach bit, and obstruction of justice. But fortunately for some, we had a Justice Department that saw crimes committed by Democrats did not need to be pursued or punished, and things that were not crimes that Republicans did needed to be punished. People all across America are naturally going to be upset when they don't just perceive, they see and know that there is a two-tiered justice system, one for certain high-placed Democrats and one for Republicans. There are those that support Republicans and have them help them if they support President Donald Trump. That's what it has been so amazing to someone like me that has been part of the justice system and seeing the law enforced for so much of my adult life. It is unbelievable. And hearing from FBI agents around the country who repeatedly said, if anybody in our office, in this location, that location, different locations around the country, had done a fraction of the things that were done by top FBI officials in Washington, D.C., then we would have not only been fired, but they would have been looking at coming after us with criminal charges. And they were despondent because they were devoting their lives to justice. Republican and Democrat prosecutors in different parts of the country couldn't believe what they were seeing. The injustice coming from what was supposed to be the Justice Department. And what has happened since January 6th is quite sickening. It is a war. It is an assault on our Constitution. Now, it's not new. I mean, back when Mueller was head of the FBI and the Inspector General shocked everyone who was paying attention that there had been over 3,000 abuses of the national security letter that where FBI agents had just wanted to do fishing expeditions, no crime, no probable cause. They just wanted information about people when the Constitution did not permit it. So they send a national security letter demanding that a bank, a company, an individual give them all the information on another American just because they wanted it. Outrageous. And that we know occurred during President George W. Bush's administration, while Mueller was FBI director. Now, he made a statement, I'll take all the blame. Well, he should, because he created an environment at the FBI that apparently encouraged lawlessness by top FBI agents. And if you look at Ted Stevens, senator from Alaska, who was framed by the FBI, And you look at what Director Mueller did in the aftermath of finding out, if he did not know all the time before that, while it was going on, that Ted Stevens was framed, that he was not guilty of what was charged. And the FBI had evidence that he was not guilty, and they covered that up, and they helped create evidence to make it look like he was guilty. And they tried him. They saw that he was tried right before his election, and he lost him like it was between 1,000, 2,000 votes. Lost his seat. The FBI did that. Mueller's FBI did that. And when one FBI agent with a conscience pointed that out in an affidavit, the injustice that occurred by the FBI and his supervisor, well, Mueller's reward for that FBI's agency was to drive him out of the FBI, and his reward for the person that, according to the affidavit, helped frame Ted Stevens was that FBI agent was promoted, got a better job with the FBI. Apparently Mueller likes people that are quite good at framing somebody and getting them convicted, because that's what happened. That should have been all the wake-up call we needed to have a house cleaning at the top of the FBI, but that didn't happen. So the abuses got worse during the Obama administration. And you had things like Fast and Furious, where people actually encouraged the sale and distribution of weapons to drug cartels. And no one, even to this day, has ever been held accountable for that. In fact, there was a cover-up by the Justice Department then. They wouldn't let us have the documents so we could see exactly what happened. And in fact, Congress was so inane in its effort to obtain those documents that the best job, both on Fast and Furious and on Benghazi cover-up, was done by Judicial Watch. They got more documentation out of the Justice Department than Congress did, and we're charged with oversight. Even when Republicans had the majority, people were put in place that did not pursue justice and a cleanup of the Justice Department. So by the time President Trump came along, he had a number of people at the top that created the Russia hoax, a fraud. And as others have said, when the Justice Department and the FBI can work as effectively at trying to frame the President of the United States, who happened to be a billionaire, then most of us would be in severe trouble. And that's the case. And we have seen it in the last few years. We have seen a Justice Department, of course, Christopher Wray, my humble opinion, when he was put in there with a job of cleaning up the FBI, his idea of cleaning up for the FBI was to sweep as much of the dirt under the rug so that people couldn't see it. Just like now Homeland Security and Health and Human Services, their job is not to secure the border under this administration. Their job is now to get them away from the border as quickly as possible so that people don't see them. They're not in the news every night because they've moved them out. As the Border Patrolmen have said, they're looked upon as the drug cartel, the Mexican drug cartel's logistics. The drug cartel gets paid money or agreements to pay money from people they bring, including unaccompanied minors. And then the U.S. government is their logistics, because the government ships future drug sailors, traffickers, human traffickers, sex traffickers. Our U.S. government ships them around the United States so that they can get to the town the drug cartels want them, doing their drug trafficking, human trafficking, or sex trafficking. The government has become a part of the process for the drug cartels, all to the damage and often the death of American citizens. When Pancho Villa and his minions invaded, I believe it was New Mexico, General Pershing was sent down. He had a lieutenant named Patton, and they were sent down, even invade Mexico, going after Pancho Villa and his troops because there were some families that they killed in New Mexico. Well, we've got thousands of people dying from fentanyl coming from Mexico, and the answer of this administration, we heard in the last couple of days, administration is going to add 13 miles to the wall, but otherwise leave over 1,000 miles without wall. But the answer has not been to secure the border. The answer from this administration has been to say that the border is secure, when anybody with eyes to see or ears to hear knows that's not true. But the injustices that have occurred since January 6 appear to be a continuation of the goal of that one word, optics. The one word that prevented our leadership from having the National Guard on hand to ensure that the Capitol was not invaded. And for those, and we've heard it in the Judiciary Committee, that's why I had videotape, which we not allowed to have here on the House floor, obviously, but had the videotape of John Sullivan, a Trump hater who's been supportive of groups that wanted Trump pulled out of office, or as Mr. Sullivan, I'll paraphrase, wanted to yank him out of the White House and do things to him, but he was one of the first ones in the Capitol. He's on video, and he was bragging, see, I told you we'd be able to do this, getting into the Capitol. He was there egging on people, even at the shooting of the young lady that was shot by the Capitol policeman. Many of us would like to know the full circumstances of so much that went on here, but that the thousands of hours of tape are not being used. Now, some of us had heard that the wonderful Capitol policeman, Officer Sicknick, that he had died of natural causes. And yet it was all over the media that he was beaten with a fire extinguisher. Turned out that was completely false. And there's an article about that by Julie Kelly in American Greatness, April 26. Her article pointed out there's no reason to keep these men in jail, let alone in solitary confinement in a D.C. prison. The cause of Capitol Officer Brian Sicknick's untimely death on January 7th is finally settled, but the prosecution of his alleged attackers rages on. After months of dishonest accounts about what happened to Officer Sicknick, first, that he was bludgeoned to death by insurrectionists with a fire extinguisher, and then that he died of an allergic reaction to bear spray. The D.C. Medical Examiner's Office confirmed the 42-year-old Officer Sicknick died of a stroke. The chemical sprayed in his direction during the chaos outside the Capitol on January 6th did not contribute to his death. In its haste to bolster the new narrative, maintaining Sicknick was killed by rioters wielding bear spray, the acting attorney general was in on the lie from the start. The Justice Department charged two men with the chemical attack. George Tenios and Julian Cater were arrested March 14th and charged with several crimes, including 4 counts related to possession and use of a deadly or dangerous weapon, and for conspiring ahead of time to use the spray against the officers. They've been behind bars ever since. Both were transported to the nation's capital, where they joined dozens of January 6 detainees held in solitary confinement in a D.C. jail. A judge on Tuesday, this was dated April 26, will consider motions filed by their attorneys to release both defendants as they await trial. This says, as I've reported for the past few months, federal courts, at the direction of Joe Biden's Justice Department, are denying bond to nonviolent protesters as their cases continue a slow slog through an intentionally overloaded D.C. judicial system. The presumption of innocence has been suspended for Trump supporters involved in the January 6th protests, largely based on a supposed thought crime of doubting the legitimacy of the 2020 election. And parenthetically, if that were a crime, there would be Democrats that would have been arrested and gone to jail going back to January of 2001, when objection was made to electors. There were no woke corporations back then saying they would no longer do business with those Democrats, nor did they do that after the Democrat objection on January 6th of 2005, or after the significant number of objections on January 6th of 2017. And now all of a sudden it's supposed to be a crime, a heinous act to object under the rules and the Constitution. Things have got to turn around here if we're going to save this little experiment in self-government. Anyway, dangerous evidence, the article questions. Law enforcement officials have argued in court pleadings that defendants shouldn't have unfettered access to tens of thousands of hours of video evidence because they might pass along the information to those who wish to attack the Capitol again. Instead, according to a recent Politico article, prosecutors are, quote, working to build an archive of video that would permit defendants to peruse relevant clips, but sharply restrict their access and permit prosecutors a chance to object if they feel such footage would be misused or present a risk. Now, that sounds a great deal like what the prosecutors and FBI were saying about Ted Stevens and their evidence, that they restricted him having access to his own evidence that would have proved his innocence had he been allowed all the evidence that were seized from his home and other places. Anyway, toward the end of the article, it says Cater's family is asking the court to release him on a $15 million bond guaranteed by 16 family members. As one journalist noted, that amount is 3 times higher than Harvey Weinstein's bail. Judge Thomas Hogan will hear the case on Tuesday, then decide whether to keep Cater and Tenios behind bars until their next court date or confine the pair to home detention. There's no reason to keep these men in jail, let alone in solitary confinement in a D.C. prison. Cherry-picked video evidence does not support the weapon charges against them. The chief investigator confessed no evidence exists to prove the can of spray ever was used or that Cater sprayed it at anyone, including police officers. Justice Department's refusal to allow access to the video evidence raises plenty of red flags. Neither man has a criminal record. George Tenios and Julian Cater pose no threat to society. Their only crime, as is the case with hundreds of nonviolent Capitol protesters, was supporting Donald Trump and daring to question the validity of the 2020 presidential election, a doubt shared by tens of millions of Americans. So we've got federal judges that are playing along with this whole outrageous miscarriage of justice for hundreds of Americans that were concerned, as Democrats were in 2001, 2005, 2017. But fortunately for them, Republicans didn't try to create a federal crime out of questioning election results. Julie Kelly has done extraordinary research on what has occurred since January 6th and on January 6th. Some points that she has found: on April 28, 2021, Paul Hooper heard a ruckus in his house. He was in his bedroom answering emails. Clad in his pajamas, he went downstairs to see what was happening. He was confronted by at least a dozen FBI agents, some pointing guns at him and his wife, Marilyn. The couple, along with their house guests, including a teenager, were handcuffed. You know, where is the outrage that we've been hearing in the Judiciary Committee about young people being unfairly treated? Where's the outrage about the treatment of people since January 6th by any Democrats, who even our vice president was raising money to pay their bail in places where there was not just looting, there was burning, there was physical assaults, and like in Missouri, even death of innocent people. But the Hoopers, they were placed in separate rooms in their home in Alaska without legal counsel, without the chance to inspect a warrant. Paul and Marilyn were interrogated for hours about their trip to Washington, D.C. in January. They attended President Trump's speech and walked down to the Capitol. They committed no crime. They did not even enter the building. They did what tens of thousands of Americans did on January 6th. They traveled to their nation's capital, just like all the leftists did that did such damage and tried to physically assault some of us here in the Capitol last year. Yet, not only were they not punished, those of us that were being threatened and people running after us, we were not protected at all. But Paul and Marilyn, as they were so unfairly and unjustly treated by the FBI and the Department of Justice, the FBI claimed they were looking for Nancy Pelosi's stolen laptop, and they said Marilyn looked like a woman in the Capitol who was a suspect, but the photos that anybody could clearly see, the photos the FBI finally presented eventually, it was clear. That wasn't Marilyn. That wasn't Paul. They didn't take the laptop, yet their freedom was taken from them to teach a lesson. Agents threatened both of Paul and Marilyn Hoopers, a teenager that was there. They threatened them with legal recourse. They ransacked their home. They took their cell phones and their computers. They even took a copy of the Declaration of Independence. Wish they would read it and understand it. The Hoopers have not been charged with any crime, but more than 400 Americans have been charged with various offenses relating to January 6th. Most face nonviolent trespassing and disorderly conduct charges. But yesterday, the Justice Department announced the arrest of an active duty United States Marine stationed at Quantico for his involvement in the protests that day. Joe Biden's Justice Department is criminalizing political protest, but only political protest by Republicans or conservatives. They're destroying the lives of American families. They're weaponizing the events of January 6th to silence Trump-supporting Americans. You don't have to take our word for it. Michael Sherwin, the acting U.S. attorney who handled the first few months of the Capitol breach probe, bragged that his office arrested at least 100 people between January 6th and January 20th to stop people from coming to D.C. to protest Joe Biden's inauguration. Quote, I wanted to make sure there was shock and awe that we could charge as many people as possible before the 20th, and it worked because we saw through the media posts that people were afraid to come to D.C. because if they go there, we're going to get charged, unquote. That's only part of what's happening. Dozens of Americans have been hauled out of their homes, transported to Washington, D.C., and held in solitary confinement for months, awaiting delayed trials with no end in sight. Nearly all have no criminal record. Some are veterans and ex-law enforcement officers, but the Justice Department is throwing the book at them. Even worse, federal judges and prosecutors argue that these folks are a danger to society because they doubted the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. In one case, against a man who didn't even enter the building, a federal judge nonetheless denied bond and said this, quote, this is an offense that at the bottom was an attempt to stop democracy from moving forward because people were unhappy about the results of the election. I don't think the defendant will follow my conditions if he believes I am part of this machine of the democratic process. Well, that judge ought to be part of the Democratic Justice Department because that's how that judge is acting. Not as a judge, but as an advocate, as a part and parcel of this. You could call it a conspiracy because these people are working to silence anybody that supported Donald Trump. But that's one example of how government lawyers and judges are criminalizing someone's belief about the 2020 presidential election. And it's much like the U.S. attorney was saying, you know, they charge enough people, then Trump supporters are not going to be willing to come back out because they know they'll get charged. We have in this city political prisoners held hostage by their own government, victims of an unequal system of justice in a country where rioters and looters on the left are let off the hook, even considered heroes, while those on the right are considered hardened criminals without any record before a trial can even begin. Here's how one defense attorney described the conditions at the D.C. Correctional Treatment Facility. Detainees are held in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. They cannot shower or shave regularly. Some have been physically assaulted by prison guards. They cannot play a role in their own defense. They have no regular access to tablets to communicate with their lawyers or family members. In-person meetings with counsel is nearly impossible. Conversations between defendants and lawyers are overheard by other defendants and their lawyers in addition to prison guards. In a detention hearing on May 11th, for the 2 men accused of using pepper spray against police officers against the late Officer Brian Sicknick. One defense lawyer told the judge he had not been able to speak with his client for 2 weeks. Julian Cater, George Tanios, about whom we were speaking earlier, they were arrested in March for allegedly spraying the officers. They're still being held in D.C. jail for weeks awaiting trial. This week, a federal judge, the one we spoke of earlier, denied bail to both defendants. Julian Cater's family was willing to put up $15 million bond package. Neither man has a criminal record, but you have a judge and a Justice Department with an agenda. And so what these men are getting is not only not bond, but they're getting the most injustice the Department of Justice can throw at them. They never even went inside the building, and the government has yet to prove their case at all. The judge basically tried the case himself this week without either defendant present. Judge Hogan said the men are a danger to society because they attempted to halt the democratic process. Well, if that were a crime, we would have dozens of Democrats with a criminal record for coming in here the first and only time in American history that one party came in, took over the House floor, and prevented a session from taking place. Never happened before, never happened since. Of course, the election didn't go too well for Democrats after that. We had a very weak Speaker of the House at the time who kept saying those people will be punished for their improprieties, for their unethical and unruly behavior. There were at least a dozen or more rules of the House that were violated by Democrats, by most of the Democrats. You're not supposed to sit on the House floor, on the floor itself. You're not supposed to bring food. Heck, food was catered in here. You're not supposed to take pictures in here. There were not only pictures taken, but there was a broadcast going on from the House floor. There were just rule after rule were broken, but there could have potentially been criminal charges, but none were made. None of us filed any criminal charges, even though the insurrectionists in the Democratic Party came in here and prevented the House from doing business for 24 hours. Paul Ryan kept saying he was going to do something about it. He never did. No one has ever been punished for the massive improprieties that took place. But if we're going to charge people for preventing, and many of these people are finally being charged with preventing, or conspiring to prevent Congress from taking action, well, that's exactly what many of the House Democrats did that day when they prevented for 24 hours us from going into session here. And the fact is, I didn't and wouldn't advocate that any of the Democratic representatives be charged or should have been charged criminally. There were rule violations. I felt like it should have been handled by ethics, but I would not want criminal charges brought against other members of the House for the very things that Trump supporters are being charged with. I would have felt that was inappropriate against Democrat members of Congress then, and I feel like it's inappropriate for those who were nonviolent, at least many of them who, it's a misdemeanor, it should be, but they're trying to make it for optics purposes into some kind of justification for having metal detectors out here, even though They ought to be other places. Capitol Police ought to be other places. But it's a great deal like, I look around, anybody that's not speaking has to wear a mask because of optics. We want people to think there's this grave, great danger here. That's why the fence took the outer fence down. Inner fence is still around here. We got National Guard troops that could be helping secure our border. That doesn't violate posse comitatus because they would be enforcing our border against non-American citizens. So posse comitatus that I hear people bring up, it wouldn't come into play. They could be down there helping secure the border, but instead, they're stuck around here, parking garages. I see them in parking garage all the time. That is outrageous. And why are they all here still after all this time? Optics. Optics. It was not, as President Bush said when he signed a bill, to be used against political protesters, but that's exactly what's being done right now. The bill did not apply to the thousands of people who occupied the Senate and tried to stop the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh in 2018. It didn't apply to protesters who tried to stop his swearing in by banging on the doors of the Supreme Court. It didn't apply to any of the protests we've seen over the years in Washington, D.C., but people who were here on that day are being charged with that offense, a felony punishable by up to 20 years in jail. The media and Democrats continue to misrepresent what happened on January 6th. But it's nearly 200 people have been charged with, and I'm quoting, obstruction of an official proceeding. And that's the vague law that President Bush signed into law in 2002. It was aimed at white-collar criminals after the Enron scandal. And yet it's being used only against people who support President Trump. None of those who officially obstructed the House chamber for 24 hours who were members of the Democratic Party. Well, the claim about a fire extinguisher being used to murder Officer Sicknick even made it into the Democrats' impeachment memo. But it was a lie. We finally learned he died tragically at the age of 42 of a stroke. The three other people did not die because of what happened that day. 2 died of heart failure. 1 died of a drug overdose. There's no evidence, as has been said on January 7th, that this was an armed insurrection. Armed meaning with firearms. There were no firearms. Of course, Bruno Kua had a little baton. He didn't use it against anybody, but he's still being charged with using a deadly weapon. Not one person has been charged with bringing a firearm to the Capitol. People have been charged with carrying or using things like mace or a helmet, but no one brought a gun into this building. And we still have no one in custody for allegedly planting inoperable pipe bombs near the headquarters of the DNC and the RNC. What was all that about? What we've wanted, someone's tried to get information about those bombs. Normally people don't put bombs that don't work out where people can see them unless it's simply for the optics. Now, when they're serious, they do what Bill Ayers people, the Weather Underground, did when they set off a bomb in the U.S. Senate. To me, that was more of an attack, more of a war or an attack on democracy. When in this very room, terrorists from Puerto Rico came in here and shot 4 House members. 4 members of Congress shot in this room in 1954. To me, that was more of an attack on democracy, for the president's information. When Pearl Harbor occurred, that was more, and thousands, 2,000 to 3,000 people were killed. That was more of an attack on democracy than the protests of January 6th. When 9/11 occurred, and I know it's been so long ago, there are a lot of people that have forgotten apparently about 9/11. 3,000 people killed. The Pentagon was hit. The 2 World Trade Centers were hit. Thousands died. That was more of an attack on democracy. I just want the president to understand there have been things worse than people without any firearms coming into a building. Now, I've been a judge. I wouldn't put up with that kind of activity. Disruption, sure, people go to jail for that. They would not, I wouldn't get a charge of felony normally, but certainly misdemeanors. So there is punishment that should and could be used, but not innocent people. Not like Paul and Marion. FBI swarm their home, take all this stuff. That's just so wrong. Well, the cover-up of the video that was available here in the Capitol that could really establish what all went on is atrocious. And I've got so many friends in the Capitol Police. They're wonderful people. I admire them greatly. But there are people in leadership positions, apparently, that are covering up video of what went on here. And now even the news media is asking the D.C. District Court for access to video evidence presented in virtual court proceedings. As one of my Republican colleagues said this week in the House Oversight Committee hearing, we need to release all the tapes so the American people can see what happened before, during, and after the disturbance on January 6th. There's no doubt people came here on January 6th to cause trouble. Most did not come here to cause trouble. Most came here to protest in the manner that I've advocated for years, and that is the effective manner that Dr. King advocated for. So much more is done by peaceful protest, but Americans need to make their voices heard. And this power-hungry group occupying positions of power in Washington, D.C. right now, they're wanting to intimidate and use injustice for their own political purposes. The overwhelming number of people caught up in this, quote, unprecedented investigation, as the Justice Department promises, they're actually nonviolent, peaceful Americans. Their only crime was supporting Donald Trump and concern about the fraud Democrats have been telling us about in elections for many years. Article from April 12th, Julie Kelly, indefinite incarceration for protesters with wrong politics. And great article, documents about different people. They're getting death threats. The press have helped bring about all kinds of calamities on people whose crime was being concerned about the election and being here and peacefully protesting. But it documents some of the travesties that are occurring with some people whose only crime was being concerned about fairness in the election in America. Another, as capital defendants rot in D.C. jail, Portland rioters get leniency. Documents how lenient the Justice Department, yes, same Justice Department that's locking up in solitary confinement people that really didn't commit the actions they're charged with. That same Justice Department is going easy on the looters and the destroyers in Portland. Article April 19th, from insurrectionist to interruptionist. And that's probably going to be the charge that ends up sticking in most cases. They obstructed Congress from their jobs for not for 24 hours like the Democrat members of Congress that kept us from having session in here for 24 hours. Not like that, but just for a matter of hours till things were under control. Then we were back in no time, back here in this chamber doing our business. But the FBI raided the Homer couple's home. That was with guns drawn. Here's this 18-year-old Bruno Kua. The complaint I have here, he's charged with assault on a federal officer, yet there's been no evidence presented of any assault on a federal officer. Civil disorder, obstruction of an official proceeding. That's the one that that's why Julie Kelly says they've gone from insurrectionist to interruptionist. Enter or remain on the floor or gallery of either House of Congress, violent entry or disorderly conduct, engage in physical violence, obstruct or impede passage, and parade, demonstrate, or picket on Capitol grounds. So that's what we've come to, locking up this 18-year-old with no criminal history whatsoever. Interesting, in Bruno Kua's case, the Justice Department was arguing since he had begun to be homeschooled before January 6th, and as thousands and thousands of American children have been, since teachers are refusing in so many places to come teach them, that's used by the Justice Department to say you can't allow this guy to be released, this dangerous 18-year-old with no criminal history. He said, oh, but look at his social media, and he's being homeschooled, so you can't release him home because, that's where he came from. That would be terrible. And yet, in Portland, they're letting people go right and left with long criminal histories and with actual violence that they've committed. Anyway, Rick Manning has a good article from May 12th in Town Hall. Biden's America resembles the bad old days of 1973. I keep expecting at any time our president to say, we need to put out big pens with the letters WIN on them, as Gerald Ford did. That stood for Whip Inflation Now. And that didn't work. Wearing a pen with Whip Inflation Now did not whip inflation, nor did Jimmy Carter wearing a sweater heal or fix our problem with a lack of energy. That didn't work, but that looks like the kind of thing we're headed back to. There is a great deal of injustice, and I would think for all of those who obstructed an official proceeding here on the House floor under the leadership of the Democrat Party leadership, that for far longer disrupted the House proceeding, violating countless House rules, I would think that that is in someone's background, that they have committed that crime that these people are being charged with, that we get a lot more sympathy from my colleagues across the aisle. Many were not here then, but the ones that were, that committed that crime being charged now, have it a little easier on those who interrupted us that day. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2020,